They had a plan, maybe not conscious detailed scheme, but definite expectations about how this would unfold. They'd push you away and you'd pursue. They'd withdraw and you'd wait. They'd create distance and you'd bridge it. They'd reject the relationship and you'd fight for it. They'd maintain defended position and you'd continue organizing your life around their comfort while accepting scraps in return. The script was clear in their mind. They'd keep you available while maintaining their emotional distance. They'd get the benefits of your presence without the vulnerability of genuine partnership. They'd have their defended independence while keeping you as backup plan. They could activate when loneliness became unbearable. Everything was plotted, not maliciously, not with conscious manipulation, but their defensive system had clear expectations about how you'd respond to their patterns, and those expectations allowed them to maintain patterns without fear of permanent consequences. They thought they had you figured out, thought they knew your limits, thought they understood the dynamic well enough to control outcomes, and then everything backfired, spectacularly, completely, in ways their defended psychology couldn't predict and can't process. You didn't pursue when they pushed away. You accepted the distance. You didn't wait when they withdrew. You built life without them. You didn't bridge the gap they created. You let the gap become permanent separation. You didn't fight for the relationship. You chose yourself. Every expectation they had about your behavior was wrong. Every assumption about your limits was false. Every prediction about how this would play out didn't match what actually happened. And now, they're experiencing something their defended system is completely unprepared for. Fury and shock that their patterns didn't produce expected results, that their tested strategies failed catastrophically, that the person they thought they had figured out just demonstrated they never understood you at all. They're mad because you didn't play your part in their script. They're shocked because the control they thought they maintained was illusion you were allowing them to maintain until you stopped allowing it. And both the anger and the shock are revealing something their defended ego cannot acknowledge. They never had the power they thought they had, the understanding they assumed they had, or the control they needed to believe they had. Everything they plotted backfired, and the backfiring is destroying the entire narrative they built about themselves and about you. The three specific expectations they had that your behavior completely destroyed. The avoidance shock isn't about losing you generally. It's about specific predictions their defensive system made that your actual behavior proved catastrophically wrong. Understanding what they expected helps you see why they're so shocked. They expected you to pursue them indefinitely, proving you needed them more than they needed you, which would maintain the power dynamic their safety depends on. The first expectation was pursuit. When they pushed you away, when they created distance, when they withdrew from the relationship, they expected you to pursue, expected you to reach out repeatedly, trying to reconnect, expected you to express pain about the distance, expected you to try to convince them to reconsider, expected you to demonstrate through pursuit behavior that you couldn't accept the ending, couldn't move on, needed them too much to let go without fight. This pursuit would have served multiple functions for them, would have validated their significance. You're pursuing them, which means they matter enormously to you, would have confirmed the power dynamic they needed. They're the pursued, which means they control whether you get what you're pursuing, would have maintained their defended position while getting validation. They could reject your pursuit while feeling good about being wanted enough that you're making the effort. Your pursuit was supposed to be their validation that didn't require their vulnerability. But you didn't pursue. You accepted the ending completely, walked away without trying to change their mind. The absence of pursuit destroyed the first expectation, and destroying this expectation eliminated the validation they were expecting. inverted the power dynamic they thought was solid, and proved they mattered less to you than their ego needed to believe they mattered. They expected you to stay emotionally engaged through contact, allowing them to maintain access to you while keeping you at defended distance that felt comfortable. If not pursuit, they at least expected ongoing contact. You'd reach out occasionally. You'd suggest staying friends. You'd maintain some thread of connection that kept you in their orbit even if relationship was over. Maybe send occasional message about something that reminded you of them. Maybe ask how they're doing. Maybe maintain enough contact. That door between you remained at least cracked. This ongoing contact would have served them by confirming they still have access to you, if they want it, that you're still thinking about them enough to maintain connection. That relationship ending doesn't mean you're completely gone from their life. The contact would have kept you available as option. They could reactivate if they changed their mind, or got lonely enough to want you back. But you didn't maintain contact. You went completely silent, removed yourself entirely from their orbit, closed every door so thoroughly they have no access to you even if they wanted it. This complete absence, where minimal contact should have been, destroyed their second expectation. And destroying this expectation eliminated their safety net, the assumption that you'd stay available in background of their life as option they could activate when ready. Your silence proved you're not available, not waiting, not accessible even if they decided they made mistake. The door isn't cracked, it's locked. And locked door, where cracked door was expected, is shock their system wasn't prepared to handle. They expected you to be devastated by the ending, suffering visibly while they moved on easily, which would confirm their narrative that they're the stronger one who cares less. The third expectation was your devastation. They expected you to suffer, expected the ending to break you, expected visible pain that would prove they mattered to you, that losing them created impact you'd struggle to recover from. Your suffering would have confirmed their narrative. They're the stronger one, the one who cares less, the one who can walk away easily while you're destroyed by losing them. This narrative protects their ego by maintaining the belief that they're less vulnerable, less affected, less damaged by relationship endings than others are. But you aren't devastated. You're thriving, building extraordinary life without them. Visibly better off having left than you were while staying. This thriving, where devastation was expected, destroyed their third expectation. And destroying this expectation inverted the entire narrative. You're the strong one who's fine after ending. They're the one who's suffering. You're the one who cares less about their absence. They're the one whose life feels diminished without you. The narrative that protected their ego, that they're less affected by relationship losses, is destroyed by evidence that you're completely unaffected while they're barely functioning through the grief. Every expectation about your response was wrong, and each wrong expectation is revealing they never understood you, never had the control they thought they had, never were as powerful in the dynamic as they needed to believe they were. How your unexpected behavior triggered rage, they can't process or justify. The avoidant experiencing anger about your behavior is revealing, not about you doing anything wrong, but about their ego being unable to tolerate that you didn't perform the role they expected. They're furious you didn't fight for the relationship because your acceptance of the ending suggests they're not worth fighting for, which wounds their ego. The anger isn't rational. They rejected you. They ended it through their patterns or through explicit rejection. They made clear they didn't want the relationship to continue. And now, they're furious you didn't fight for it. The fury is irrational on surface. Why would they want you to fight for something they rejected? But the fury makes sense from an ego perspective. Your fighting for the relationship would have meant they're worth fighting for. would have meant you couldn't accept losing them without resistance, would have meant their value was high enough that you'd battle to keep them despite their rejection. You're not fighting means you accepted they weren't worth fighting for, accepted that relationship with them wasn't valuable enough to try to preserve despite their rejection. This acceptance wounds their ego. They wanted to be the one doing the rejecting while being the person you couldn't accept losing. They wanted both, the power of rejecting you and the validation of you fighting to prevent the rejection from becoming permanent. Your acceptance of the rejection without fighting eliminated the validation while leaving them with only the rejection they initiated. The fury is their ego's response to being shown they're not valuable enough to fight for, even after they rejected you. They're angry you went silent, because silence denies them the significance they needed your continued attention to prove, making them feel irrelevant. Similarly, the anger about your silence is revealing. They pushed you away. They created distance. They made clear they wanted space from you. And now, they're angry you're giving them permanent space through your silence. The anger is ego's response to not mattering. If you were still reaching out, still trying to contact them, still attempting to maintain some connection despite their rejection, you'd be proving they matter to you, proving they're significant in your life, proving they're still on your mind, even though relationship ended. Your silence eliminates all of this proof. Silence means they don't matter enough to contact, don't occupy enough space in your mind to generate reaching out, don't hold enough significance to warrant even occasional message. The silence communicates irrelevance, and irrelevance is what ego cannot tolerate. They needed your attention to prove they matter. Your silence denies them this proof. The fury about your silence is fury about being made to feel irrelevant to someone they expected to remain oriented toward them indefinitely. They wanted you gone, but still thinking about them. Silent, but they're not getting that. You're gone, and clearly not thinking about them. And this combination, absence plus indifference, is creating rage because it denies them the significance their ego desperately needs. They're mad you're thriving without them because your happiness proves the relationship was holding you back, which means their presence was net negative in your life. The anger about your thriving is particularly revealing. If you were struggling, suffering, diminished by their absence, they could maintain narrative that you needed them, that they were valuable presence in your life, that losing them created deficit. But you're thriving, clearly happier without them than you were with them, visibly lighter, freer, more yourself now that you're not in relationship with them. This thriving proves something their ego cannot accept. The relationship was holding you back. Their presence in your life was costing you more than it was providing. You're better off without them than you were with them. This proof inverts the narrative they needed. They needed to believe they were a valuable addition to your life that you'd suffer from losing. Your thriving proves they were a burden you're relieved to have removed. And this proof that you're better without them creates rage because it means they weren't the valuable person adding to your life, but were the limitation you had to escape to become yourself. The anger at your thriving is anger at being shown. They were obstacle to your happiness rather than source of it. The uncomfortable mirror. Turn what your investment in their shock reveals about your residual attachment. But here's the uncomfortable question you need to examine right now. Why does their shock matter to you? Why do you need to know they're mad and shocked that everything backfired? If you're genuinely done, if you're genuinely thriving, if you're genuinely building life that doesn't reference them, their emotional state about how things turned out should be completely irrelevant to your well-being. The fact that you want to know they're shocked that you need confirmation their plans backfired, that some part of you is satisfied by their anger about not getting what they expected. This reveals you're still oriented toward them, still organizing emotional energy around their experience of losing you, still needing their suffering or shock or anger to validate that leaving was right choice. And this need, this investment in their emotional response to the backfiring is evidence you're not as far past them as you think you are. Because truly done means you don't care what they expected or how they feel about expectations not being met. Truly moved on means their shock is background noise you don't even hear. Truly choosing yourself means you're not tracking their emotional state at all because you're too busy building to care about their reactions to the building. Your need to know they're mad and shocked reveals where you still are, partially attached to someone you claim to be done with, partially oriented toward their recognition even in their anger, partially using their negative emotional response as validation of your worth. Stop needing to know they're shocked. Stop tracking their anger. Stop organizing any part of your internal world around how they're responding to outcomes they didn't predict, whether they're mad or not mad, shocked or not shocked, dealing with backfiring or handling it fine. None of it should matter to someone who's genuinely moved on. Let them have whatever emotional response they're having without your knowledge or your witness or your satisfaction in it. You have better things to do than monitor the emotional fallout in someone else's life of choices that person made. What the backfiring actually reveals about the power dynamic that never existed the way they thought it did. The avoidant shock and anger about everything backfiring is revealing fundamental truth about the relationship that their defended ego is only now being forced to confront. They thought they had power because they controlled the distance, but distance only gave them power as long as you were trying to close it and you stopped trying. Throughout relationship, they maintained distance, emotional distance, physical distance when they withdrew, psychological distance through their defended unavailability. And maintaining this distance felt like power, felt like they controlled the dynamic, felt like they decided how close things got, and you accepted whatever closeness they allowed. But the power was illusion. The distance only gave them power as long as you were trying to close it. Your trying to bridge the gap meant the gap mattered to you, which meant they controlled something you wanted access to. But the moment you stopped trying to close distance, the moment you accepted the distance and built your life around their absence, rather than around trying to restore their presence, the power evaporated. Distance from someone who's not trying to close it isn't power. It's just distance. They're over there being distant, and you're over here being fine with the distance, and there's no power dynamic in that, because power requires someone wanting what the other person controls. You stopped wanting access to them. The distance they maintained stopped being thing they had power over, because you stopped valuing the closeness they were withholding. Their power was dependent on your pursuit. Your pursuit stopped. Their power disappeared. And they're shocked because they confused your willingness to pursue with your inability to stop pursuing. They thought you needed them too much to ever stop trying. You proved you didn't need them at all. They assumed your patience meant you'd wait indefinitely. But patience has limits, and they mistook your endurance for unlimited tolerance. They saw your patience, saw you tolerate their patterns month after month, saw you give them space when they withdrew, and accept them back when they returned, saw you forgive their emotional unavailability repeatedly, and they interpreted this patience as infinite resource they could draw on indefinitely, interpreted your understanding as guarantee you'd never leave, interpreted your tolerance as evidence you'd accept anything they did because you were too invested to enforce consequences. But patience isn't infinite. Understanding doesn't equal unlimited tolerance. Your staying despite their patterns wasn't confirmation you'd stay forever. It was you giving them time and space to change while maintaining hope that change would occur. When change didn't occur, when patterns continued, when sufficient time passed without improvement, your patience ended. Not because you gave up prematurely, because patience has natural limits, and they exceeded those limits. They mistook the depth of your patience for absence of limits. Thought because you'd tolerated this much, you'd tolerate anything, but tolerance has threshold, and they crossed it. Your leaving wasn't you being impatient or giving up too easily. It was you having reached the natural limit of reasonable patience with someone who demonstrated through sustained behavior that they weren't going to change. They're shocked because they thought they could take unlimited withdrawals from your patience without ever depleting the account. You proved the account had a limit they exceeded. They believed you needed the relationship more than they did, but your thriving proves you were the one doing them favor by staying as long as you did. The fundamental assumption underlying all their expectations was that you needed the relationship more than they did, that you were more invested, more attached, more dependent on the connection. This assumption made them feel safe, made them feel like they had less to lose, made them believe they could maintain patterns without fear of permanent loss because you needed them too much to leave. But your thriving after leaving destroys this assumption. You don't need the relationship more. You're clearly better off without it. You weren't more dependent. You're more independent now than you were while with them. You weren't the one who needed the connection. They needed what you were providing while you were accommodating what they couldn't provide. The assumption was backward. You were the one doing favor by staying. They were the one benefiting from the relationship more. And now that you're gone and they're suffering while you're thriving, this inversion of the assumed dependency is revealed. They needed you more than you needed them. They just couldn't see it while you were there because you were accommodating their limitations in ways that made them feel like you needed them when actually they needed your accommodation. The thriving is proof. You're fine without them. Better than fine. They're destroyed without you. The dependency was theirs, not yours. This revelation is shock their ego cannot integrate. The specific ways they're trying to restore, control, now that everything has backfired, and why these attempts will fail too. The avoidance, shock, and anger are motivating new strategies designed to restore the control they lost. Understanding these attempts helps you recognize and resist them. They reach out with breadcrumbs testing if your boundaries are real, hoping to find the pursuing, accommodating person they remember, instead of the boundaried person you've become. After enough time passes with their expectations not being met, they often reach out, not with genuine transformation or accountability, with breadcrumbs, casual message. How are you? Saw something that reminded me of you. Hope you're doing well. These breadcrumbs are testing if your boundaries are real. Testing if the silence was just phase that's passed. Testing if you're back to being the accommodating person who'd respond warmly to their minimal effort. They're hoping to find the old you, the one who'd accept breadcrumbs and respond with warmth that would restore their access without requiring their transformation. But you're not the old you. You're a boundaried version who doesn't accept breadcrumbs, who doesn't respond to minimal effort, who maintains the silence because boundaries are real and breadcrumbs don't meet the requirements for re-engagement. When breadcrumbs meet with continued silence or with response that enforces boundaries, they're shocked again. Shocked that even minimal contact doesn't restore access. Shocked that you're actually requiring genuine transformation rather than accepting performance of change. The breadcrumbing fails because you're not who you were when they lost you. You've evolved, and breadcrumbs that would have worked on past version of you don't work on current version who knows her worth. They try to make you jealous by appearing to move on quickly, attempting to trigger pursuit through demonstrating they don't need you, which backfires when you're genuinely indifferent. Sometimes the strategy is making you jealous, posting about new person, making sure you know they're dating, demonstrating publicly that they're over you and moving on easily. The strategy is designed to trigger your pursuit, to make you feel replaced and therefore motivated to reach out to compete for their attention, to activate your fear of loss by showing you they don't need you. But the strategy fails for same reason all their expectations failed. You're not who they think you are. You're not invested in competing for them. You're not threatened by them dating someone else. You're genuinely indifferent to whether they're moving on or not, because you've already moved on. The jealousy they're trying to trigger doesn't activate, because you don't care enough about them to feel jealous. Their moving on doesn't create fear of loss. It creates relief that they're someone else's problem now. The strategy backfires because it's predicated on you still wanting them, still caring about having them, still being invested in relationship with them. And you're none of those things. You're building life where who they're dating is background noise you don't even process as relevant to your experience. They oscillate between angry confrontation and vulnerable pleading, trying different emotional manipulations to find the one that breaks your boundaries. When breadcrumbs fail and jealousy fails, they often oscillate between strategies. Maybe angry message about how you gave up too easily, how you didn't fight for the relationship, how you're the one who failed them. Then when anger doesn't produce desired response, vulnerable message about how much they miss you, how they understand what they lost, how they want to try again. The oscillation is trying different emotional manipulations to find the one that works. Trying to activate your guilt through anger about your failure. Trying to activate your compassion through vulnerability about their suffering. Trying any emotional lever that might break your boundaries and restore their access. But the oscillation fails because you recognize it as manipulation. Recognize that genuine transformation doesn't oscillate between blaming you and taking responsibility. Recognize that crisis-driven reaching out isn't same as sustained demonstrated change. The oscillation just confirms you made right choice by leaving someone whose emotional expression is strategic rather than genuine, whose outreach is about restoring their access rather than about honoring what you need. What their shock and anger actually mean for both of your futures. The avoidant being mad and shocked that everything backfired creates specific implications worth understanding clearly, so you can use this knowledge appropriately rather than letting it pull you back into their orbit. Their shock confirms they never actually understood you, which validates every moment you felt unseen during relationship. They're shocked by your behavior. Shocked you didn't pursue. Shocked you went silent. Shocked you're thriving. This shock is confession. They never understood you. If they understood you, they'd have predicted your behavior. They'd have known your limits. They'd have seen the thriving coming. But they didn't predict any of it. Everything you did surprised them. This surprise means they were relating to version of you that existed in their mind rather than to actual you. They thought you were a person who'd pursue indefinitely, wait forever, be destroyed by losing them. But you were never that person. You were a person with limits, with self-respect, with capacity to choose yourself when relationship became untenable. Their shock at discovering who you actually are, person they never understood, despite months or years of relationship, validates every moment during relationship when you felt unseen. You felt unseen because you were unseen. They were relating to their projection of you, not to actual you. Their shock is proof. And this proof validates that your feeling of not being truly known was accurate perception, not your insecurity. Their anger reveals they expected you to sacrifice yourself indefinitely to maintain their comfort. confirming that leaving someone who expected this was right choice. The anger at your boundaries, at your silence, at your thriving, all of it reveals underlying expectation. They expected you to continue sacrificing yourself, continue accommodating their patterns, continue making yourself smaller, continue organizing your life around their comfort. And they expected this to continue indefinitely without them having to reciprocate, transform, or honor what you were sacrificing. The anger is fury that you stopped sacrificing yourself for them, that you chose yourself over their comfort, that you enforced boundaries that protected you rather than continuing to absorb impact of their patterns. This expectation that you'd sacrifice yourself indefinitely for them confirms that leaving was right choice. You deserve partner who doesn't expect your sacrifice, who doesn't build comfort on your diminishment, who doesn't require you to make yourself smaller so they can stay defended. Their anger at you stopping the sacrifice is proof that staying would have meant continued self-betrayal. Leaving someone who expected your indefinite sacrifice for their comfort was protecting yourself from a person who saw your well-being as less important than their defended position. The backfiring is permanent education for them about cost of taking people for granted. Whether they learn from it or defend against it harder is their choice that doesn't concern you. Everything backfiring is teaching them something. Teaching that taking people for granted produces permanent loss, that patience has limits, that patterns have consequences, that assumptions about having someone figured out can be catastrophically wrong. This education is valuable, might lead to transformation, might motivate therapeutic work, might create genuine growth that benefits their future relationships, or might lead to harder defenses, might teach them to never let anyone get close enough to hurt them this way again, might create more defended person who's even less capable of intimacy. Either outcome is possible. Either outcome is theirs to choose. Not yours to influence or control or care about. They're being educated. What they do with the education is their responsibility. Your responsibility is building life that doesn't depend on them learning appropriate lessons or using education for growth. They might transform, they might harden. Both are possibilities that don't affect your thriving. Let the education be complete. Let them choose what to do with it. You have better things to do than monitor their learning outcomes. The permanent truth about what the backfiring actually means. They plotted. You didn't perform according to their plot. Everything backfired. They're mad and shocked and trying to restore control that never existed the way they thought it did. And here's the truth that none of their shock or anger can change. The backfiring proves you were always more powerful than they believed, more valuable than they treated you, and more capable of choosing yourself than they predicted. Their shock is evidence. Evidence you're not who they needed you to be to maintain their defended comfort. Evidence you're a person who has limits, enforces boundaries, chooses herself when relationship costs more than it provides. Evidence you're stronger than they thought, less dependent than they assumed, more capable of thriving without them than their ego could tolerate believing. The backfiring isn't about their failure to predict. It's about your power they never recognized. Power to walk away. Power to go silent. Power to thrive. Power to be completely unbothered by their anger or shock or attempts to restore what they lost. You had this power all along. You just weren't using it because you were hoping they'd choose differently, change their patterns, become capable of honoring what you offered. When hope died, power activated, and the power destroyed every expectation they had, every plot they'd made, every assumption their defended ego built its comfort on. Let them be mad. Let them be shocked. Let them scramble to understand how everything backfired when they thought they had you figured out. Their emotional response to backfiring is irrelevant to your forward movement. You're not the person they thought you were. You're the person who chose herself, who enforced boundaries, who went silent, who thrived. And being that person, powerful, boundaried, thriving person who didn't perform according to their script, is more valuable than any relationship with someone who needed you to stay small and accommodating to feel comfortable. The plot backfired. You're free. That's the only truth that matters. Everything else, their shock, their anger, their attempts to restore control, is just noise happening in life you're no longer part of. Let it happen without your witness. You have extraordinary life to build with people who don't need plots to feel safe with you because they're not defended against you in first place. Build that. Live that. That's what their shock actually proves you deserve. Let them be mad. Let them be shocked. Let them scramble to understand how everything backfired when they thought they had you figured out. Their emotional response to backfiring is irrelevant to your forward movement. You're not the person they thought you were. You're the person who chose herself, who enforced boundaries, who went silent, who thrived. And being that person, powerful, boundaried, thriving person who didn't perform according to their script, is more valuable than any relationship with someone who needed you to stay small and accommodating to feel comfortable. The plot backfired. You're free. That's the only truth that matters. Everything else, their shock, their anger, their attempts to restore control, is just noise happening in life you're no longer part of. Let it happen without your witness. You have extraordinary life to build with people who don't need plots to feel safe with you because they're not defended against you in first place. Build that. Live that. That's what their shock actually proves you deserve. Why the backfiring creates permanent crisis. In their defensive system that no future strategy can resolve, the avoidant's entire psychology is built on patterns that worked, and your behavior proving those patterns catastrophically wrong creates permanent instability in their defended worldview that affects every relationship going forward. They can never trust their read on people again because they were completely wrong about you, which means they might be completely wrong about anyone. The avoidance defensive system depends on accurately reading people, understanding who will tolerate their patterns, predicting who will pursue when they withdraw, knowing who they can take for granted without losing. This reading ability is what made them feel safe. They knew what people would do, which meant they could control outcomes through managing predictable responses. But you destroyed their confidence in their reading ability. They were completely wrong about you, thought they knew your limits, and you had different limits, thought they predicted your behavior, and you behaved unpredictably, thought they understood who you were, and you were someone entirely different from who they imagined. This comprehensive failure of their people reading ability creates permanent doubt. If they were this wrong about you, someone they were in relationship with for months or years, they might be equally wrong about anyone. They can't trust their assessment of new people, can't trust their predictions about who will tolerate their patterns, can't trust the reading that previously made them feel safe through feeling like they understood and could predict others. This permanent doubt makes every future relationship more anxious because they've lost confidence in the very skill their defensive system depends on to feel safe. Every future pattern they deploy carries risk they can't calculate because the patterns that were supposed to work safely failed catastrophically with you. The patterns felt safe because they'd always worked before. Withdrawal produced pursuit. Distance created bridging effort. Emotional unavailability was tolerated. The patterns had track record of producing manageable outcomes that allowed avoidant to maintain defended position without permanent consequences. But you proved the patterns can fail, can produce permanent loss instead of temporary discomfort, followed by restoration, can cost them someone they didn't want to lose. Now, every time they deploy patterns with new person, every time they withdraw, create distance, become emotionally unavailable, there's fear the patterns might backfire the way they backfired with you. They can't trust that withdrawal will produce pursuit anymore. Can't trust that distance will be bridged. Can't trust that emotional unavailability will be tolerated indefinitely. The patterns that felt safe now carry risk, and not knowing whether patterns will produce expected manageable outcomes or catastrophic permanent loss creates anxiety that makes the patterns less effective as defensive strategies because the patterns themselves now trigger fear rather than creating safety. They've learned that giving someone everything creates vulnerability, but they've also learned that not giving enough creates permanent loss, trapping them between two fears. The backfiring taught them something. You gave them everything, and they lost you by not honoring what you gave. This creates one fear. If they let someone give them everything again, they create vulnerability to this level of loss if they destroy that relationship too. But simultaneously, they learn that not giving enough, not reciprocating adequately, not meeting someone's needs produces permanent loss. So they're trapped. If they let someone give them everything, they risk devastating loss if they can't honor it. If they don't let anyone give them much to avoid vulnerability to devastating loss, they guarantee relationships will fail because people leave when needs aren't met. They're caught between two losing strategies. Risk devastating loss by accepting everything from someone and probably destroying it through their patterns, or guarantee relationship failure by never accepting enough to create vulnerability, but also never giving enough to sustain partnership. Neither path feels safe. Neither path prevents loss. They're trapped between fears created by the backfiring. Fear of receiving too much creates vulnerability they experienced with you, and fear of receiving too little guarantees loss through unmet needs. This trap is permanent consequence of destroying someone who gave them everything. They can't find the middle ground because you proved there is no safe middle ground. Either someone gives them everything and they're vulnerable to devastating loss, or someone gives them less, and relationship fails from insufficiency. The specific moment when their anger transforms into recognition, and why recognition doesn't mean readiness. Eventually, if they have any capacity for self-reflection, the avoidance, anger, and shock transform into something more dangerous to you if you're not careful. Recognition, combined with desire to try again. The anger eventually gives way to understanding that you were right about everything, about their patterns, about your needs, about the relationship being unsustainable as it was. The shock and fury can't sustain indefinitely. Eventually, if they're capable of any self-reflection, they'll move from anger to recognition. Recognition that you were right. Right that their patterns were destructive. Right that your needs were reasonable. Right that the relationship as it existed wasn't sustainable. Right that you deserved better than what they were providing. Right that your leaving was appropriate response to their failure to change, despite clear communication about what needed to change. This recognition feels like breakthrough, feels like finally getting it, feels like the understanding that could have saved the relationship if it had arrived while you were still there. But recognition is just cognitive understanding. It's them finally seeing what you were trying to show them for months or years. And cognitive understanding is different from transformed capacity. They'll want to try again, armed with recognition, believing that understanding what went wrong means they can do it differently, which confuses awareness with capability. The recognition creates desire to try again, to prove they get it now, to demonstrate they understand what they didn't understand before. They'll reach out with this recognition, I understand now what you were trying to tell me. I see my patterns clearly. I know what I did wrong. I want to try again. I'll be different this time. And this outreach is compelling because it sounds like what you wanted to hear during relationship. Sounds like the breakthrough you were hoping for. Sounds like they've finally developed the understanding that would make relationship possible. But understanding what went wrong isn't same as having developed capacity to behave differently. They see their patterns now. They still have the same nervous system that produces those patterns. They understand they were emotionally unavailable. They don't yet have capacity for sustained emotional availability. They recognize they withdrew. They don't yet have different response when intimacy triggers their wounds. Recognition is valuable. Recognition is first step. But recognition alone doesn't create the transformation that would make relationship with them functional. That requires sustained therapeutic work that takes months or years, not just crisis-driven insight that arrives after loss. Recognition creates most dangerous moment for you when they seem to finally get it and you're most vulnerable to believing words instead of requiring demonstrated sustained behavioral change. This is the dangerous moment, when they've moved from anger to recognition, when they're articulating everything you wanted to hear, when they seem to finally understand. This is when you're most vulnerable to going back, to believing that recognition equals readiness, to accepting promises instead of requiring proof, to hoping that understanding means transformation. But this moment is trap, not malicious trap. They genuinely believe they can be different now that they understand. But belief isn't capacity. Understanding isn't transformation. Recognition that came from crisis of losing you isn't same as capacity that comes from sustained therapeutic work addressing the wounds that created patterns. If you go back during this moment of recognition without requiring demonstrated sustained behavioral change over significant time period, you'll be accepting someone who's had insight but hasn't done work. And insight without work produces temporary adjustment that reverts to original patterns once crisis passes, once they feel secure again, once fear of losing you diminishes because you're back. The most dangerous moment is when recognition makes them seem ready when they're actually just aware. Protect yourself by requiring sustained proof, not accepting crisis-driven promises. Recognition is their journey. Your protection is your responsibility. Why your continued thriving is the most powerful response to everything they plotted that backfired. The avoidant being shocked and angry and going through whatever process they're going through matters far less than what you're doing in the space their absence created. And understanding this is what keeps you free. Every day you thrive is proof the backfiring served you better than their plots succeeding would have. If everything had gone according to their plot, if you'd pursued, waited, stayed available, sacrificed yourself indefinitely, you'd be stuck in insufficient relationship that required your constant diminishment. The plot failing freed you from that, freed you to build life that doesn't organize around someone else's defended comfort, freed you to become more yourself instead of smaller version that fit their limitations, freed you to find people whose capacity matches yours. Every day you thrive is evidence that the backfiring served you, that their plots failing was the best possible outcome for your life, even though it felt like loss when it was happening. The thriving is proof, not theoretical proof, actual lived proof that life without them is better than life with them was. This proof should eliminate any temptation to go back, any softening toward their recognition, any hope that their understanding means relationship could work. The plot's backfiring gave you your life back. Don't give it back to someone whose plot's failing is the only reason you're free to be yourself. Their shock and anger are irrelevant. Your building is what matters, and building life so extraordinary, their backfiring becomes distant, interesting fact rather than current emotional reality. They're shocked, they're angry, they're going through crisis about expectations not being met, and none of it matters to your building. You're creating career you love, relationships that fulfill you, life that reflects who you actually are, rather than diminished version you became to accommodate them. Hobbies you'd abandoned, dreams you'd deferred, self you'd minimized, all of it returning and expanding in the space their absence created. This building is what matters, not their emotional process about the backfiring, your building, your expansion, your becoming. And as the building continues, as life gets fuller and richer and more aligned with who you are, their shock and anger become more distant, become less emotionally charged for you, become interesting historical fact about someone who used to be in your life rather than current reality that affects your emotional state. The building creates the distance, not time, not their recognition. Your active creation of life so fulfilling that their backfiring is just origin story of your freedom rather than ongoing drama you're emotionally invested in. The most powerful statement isn't telling them their plot's backfired. It's living so fully they become irrelevant to the life their backfiring freed you to build. You don't need to tell them everything backfired. Don't need to explain how wrong they were about you. Don't need to catalog the ways their expectations failed to match reality. The most powerful statement is you're living, you're thriving, you're building. Your complete absence from their life combined with your complete presence in your own life. This living is the statement. Louder than any words, more devastating than any explanation, more permanent than any confrontation. They see it or they don't see it. They understand it or they don't understand it. Either way, the living speaks, and what it says is, you are limitation I escaped, and escaping you freed me to become who I always was beneath the smallness I accepted to stay with you. That message, delivered through your living rather than through your telling, is the power. That's the response to everything they plotted that backfired. Not engaging with their shock, not responding to their anger, just living so extraordinarily that their entire existence is background noise you don't even register as relevant to your experience. Build that. Live that. That's freedom. That's the power they never knew you had until you used it. That's what the backfiring actually created. Not their crisis, but your liberation. And liberation doesn't require their understanding, or their shock, or their anger to be complete. It just requires your building. So build. Everything they plotted backfired. You're free. That's the whole truth. Everything else is just interesting noise in someone else's life that you're not part of anymore.